Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming this morning, and I have gladly accepted to present this plenary talk on a subject which, well, I'm not really sure of how much interest it's going to be to you, but I'll try my best to make it as interesting as possible. So the title is Applied Ethnolinguistics is Cultural Linguistics, but is it Cultural Linguistics? Now, on the face of it, if you don't see the writing on the PowerPoint behind me, that seems like a very dumb question to ask, because it's sort of like saying that it is something and then asking if it is the same thing. So okay, so applied ethnolinguistics is a theoretical model that I have developed over the last couple of years, and its aim is to help foreign language students who have a relatively advanced level in the foreign language that they are acquiring to discover and know more about the cultural values of the language community whose language they are actually studying. So it is a way of combining the teaching of culture with the teaching of language, rather than to do the two separately. Just to give you maybe a quick example, many foreign language teachers tend to have cultural classes on one side of the curriculum and language classes on the other. So this is an attempt to actually use the language in order to find out more about cultural values. So it is a form of cultural linguistics, and I draw your attention to the small c and the small l in the second point there. And so my question is going to be, is it cultural linguistics or cultural linguistics? Another two ways of saying the same thing there. For me, but I'll explain more about it in a moment, the two latter ones, so cultural linguistics all in small capitals, and cultural linguistics with capital C and capital L are the same thing. So let me start off by saying that not all cultural linguistics, small c, small l, is cultural linguistics in small capitals. And to contextualize that statement, I'll go back to something that happened to me about 20 years ago when I published a paper which was provocatively entitled Does Cognitive Linguistics Live Up to Its Name? Now, cognitive linguistics, as many of you may know, is the movement associated with Ronald Langecker and George Lakoff and other such great names. And I wrote this provocatively called paper about, well, does the movement live up to its name? Is it really cognitive? And the editors of the volume took offense. They didn't take offense because of what I was saying in terms of polemical opposition to Chomsky linguistics, because, well, that is something that everybody has agreed on, that cognitive linguistics was born out of polemical opposition to Chomsky linguistics. What they didn't like was my use of a capital C and a capital L on cognitive linguistics. They said there's no need to do that, because it's clear that there's only one kind of cognitive linguistics, and that's what we are doing, and all the rest is different. So I beg to differ, and I insisted, and in the end they reluctantly agree to let me have my way. And the point that I was trying to make is that there are in fact two kinds of cognitive linguistics. There is a cognitive linguistics with small c and small l, which is the broad area of research, any kind of linguistics that is cognitive in nature, and that does include Chomsky linguistics. Whereas there is also a movement within that broad area of research which is equally called cognitive linguistics, and in order to differentiate the two we need some typographical way of doing it, and that's why I introduced the initial C, the initial upper C and initial upper L, because that cognitive linguistics movement excludes Chomsky linguistics. And I'll give you a further quote from the same paper of mine to further contextualize that. So generativists in particular have more than once, that's what I wrote in 2001, expressed their annoyance regarding what they see as the misappropriation of the term by cognitive linguists. They too thought that they were doing cognitive linguistics. Their research interests and that of many others carry an equal entitlement to identification by means of the label cognitive linguistics. It is an entitlement which in the current climate they will find increasingly difficult to claim. And I think history has proven me right in the sense that these days no one as far as I know, refers to Chomskyan linguistics or to generative linguistics by means of the label cognitive linguistics, even though it is a form of cognitive linguistics but with very different theoretical underpinnings. I'm also glad to report that in general, in many publications that I have seen, people who explicitly advocate the cognitive linguistics capital C, capital L approach have actually taken on the habit of using initial capital C, initial capital L, in order to make sure that we know what they are talking about. Not the broad area of research, anything cognitive that deals with language, but a particular theoretical movement. Now, something similar is actually, I think, appropriate in cultural linguistics, because not all cultural linguistics is cultural linguistics, and I use I might as well tell you this now. I have in fact now decided to use lower small capitals, because just using initial uppercase is not always very useful. Take a language such as German, where all nouns are written with initial uppercase, so it wouldn't really work to oppose cognitive linguistics and cognitive linguistics or cultural linguistics and cultural linguistics just with initial capital C and capital L. So therefore nowadays I tend, if I need to make the distinction, I tend to make it clear by means of small capitals. Now these days, when people talk about cultural linguistics, whether they talk about the broad area of research or about a particular sub-area within it, there is one name that pops immediately into the minds of people who know the field, and that is Farzad Sharifian, who is a professor of linguistics who holds a personal chair of cultural linguistics, the only one in the world, I believe, personal chair of cultural linguistics at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. He is actually an Iranian linguist who migrated to Australia at the end of the 20th century and then made career in Australia, and in a very, very short time blitzed through the career path that most of us take dozens of years to accomplish, and well, he holds now that personal chair. Now, he has recently published a book called Cultural Linguistics, published by John Benjamins in 2017, and he says explicitly that in this book and in all of my recent writings, I think again that is a little bit me pushing him, prodding him and saying, well, look, you've got to make clear that people know what you're talking about. So I use the term cultural linguistics written with uppercase initials. I'll read the quote on a little further on the next few slides. So cultural linguistics, as he writes it there, with initial uppercase C and uppercase L. So cultural linguistics a la Sharifian is a subfield of small C cultural linguistics, and as I said a moment ago, I now prefer to use small capitals rather than initial C and initial L to refer to a specific field rather than a broad area. So what then is cultural linguistics with a small c and a small l? Well, as I said, it's a general area of research, and again I'm quoting from Sharifian here, the general area of research on the relationship between language and culture, which dates back at least to the 18th century and the work of influential scholars such as Wilhelm von Humboldt and later Franz Boas, Edward Sapir, Benjamin and Benjamin Wolff. Okay, so, but none of the above, as far as I know, certainly not Wilhelm von Humboldt, who didn't write in English, used the term cultural linguistics. So this is a modern label used to refer to a broad area of research. The first one who, to the best of my knowledge, used the term cultural linguistics was actually a cognitive linguist. Now, this cognitive linguist is one whom I mentioned a few moments ago. It's Ronald Langecker. Ronald Langecker wrote back in 1994, I think it was, something. The quote will appear shortly on the screen, but Sharifian again acknowledges Langecker as the source of the term cultural linguistics by writing that it was perhaps first used by one of the founders of the field of cognitive linguistics in a statement that he made emphasizing the relationship between cultural knowledge and grammar. Now here is the original quote from Langecker. Modern linguistic theory, especially generative theory, has tended to minimize, if not ignore altogether, the status of language as an aspect of culture. Most of linguistic structure for these generative linguists is regarded as being both innate and modular, leaving little scope for cultural intervention and transmission. However, the advent of cognitive linguistics, and he still wrote it with small c, small l, can also be heralded as a return to cultural linguistics. Again, small c, small l, because of course the field of cultural linguistics, such as it was eventually construed by Farzad Sharifian, didn't yet exist at the time. We are talking about 1994. Now, another cognitive linguist who did a lot to make links between cognitive linguistics as a movement, so initial C, initial upper C and initial upper case L, was Laura Jenda, who is a professor of Russian at the University of Tromsø, I believe, in Norway. And she wrote in 2008, so much more recently, a very readable paper. I've got the link at the bottom of the slide if you want to go and read it. It's worth having a look at. It's very accessible. So she wrote a paper called From Cognitive Linguistics to Cultural Linguistics, in which I quote from her conclusion, she presented a number of correlations that are, she said, preliminary and tentative, but that are presented in the hope that they will inspire a new line of research using cognitive linguistics to examine the cultural linguistic phenomena that help to define the identities of thousands of speech communities on Earth. And note how she uses upper C, uppercase L to refer to her specific movement, but she does not refer to any specific brand of cultural linguistics, and very appropriately so, she there used small c and small l. So that was perfectly clear what she was saying there. Now another person back to the past who was very influential in the birth of cultural linguistics as a specific brand of the broad field of cultural linguistics was Gary Palmer, an American anthropologist who in 1996 wrote a book called Toward the Theory of Cultural Linguistics. Now this was 2 years after Langecker's first use of the term. Probably a coincidence that I don't think that, well, one never knows, of course, but I don't think that Palmer would have known that Langecker had used the same term 2 years before him. But Palmer too was asking for a sort of effort coming from cognitive linguistics, the movement of Langecker and Lakoff, to make inroads into the area of cultural linguistics broadly. So he called upon cognitive linguists, and he meant cognitive linguists with small capitals, to take advantage of the insights gained by various approaches in anthropological linguistics, his own field, and he proposed to call the synthesis cultural linguistics. He referred to a specific theory there, his own, so he might as well, but of course I hadn't started kicking up a fuss about how to make sure that people know what you're talking about, so he still just used small initials. In the meantime too, I believe that he has started to adopt the convention of opposing the broad field small c, small l, and the larger field uppercase C, uppercase L. Okay, so this particular book left a lasting impression on Farzad Sharifian and is in fact one of the starting points for his own research into what he eventually came to call cultural linguistics. But out of respect for Palmer, whom he has always considered to be among his mentors, Sharifian hesitated for a long time before he would call his own approach to cultural linguistics. He respected Palmer and the work that he had done simply too much, and was I don't know if that's part of the Iranian or Persian culture or anything, but he respected his mentor too much to actually dare to use the same term for an approach that was based on Palmer's work, but not quite the same. He published, that is Sharifian, back in 2011 a book called Cultural Conceptualizations and Language, and that was sort of the very clumsy name of his framework, Cultural Conceptualizations and Language. And it is only in the last couple of years, say since 2015, that he actually, under the he was sort of urged by colleagues who started referring to his movement as cultural, to Sharifian's approach as cultural linguistics, and Sharifian must have said one day when he woke up, well, since everybody else is already talking about my own approach as cultural linguistics, I might as well call it that myself. So, and that's what he did. So here is the book cover again, and one of the features of cultural linguistics a la Sharifian is its multidisciplinary nature. So he writes, and this is the same quote from a moment ago, but completed, or at least partly completed. So I use the term cultural linguistics, he says, written with uppercase initials to refer to a recently developed discipline with multidisciplinary origins. Now, to give you an idea of the multidisciplinary origins, I'm not going to spend too much time on this particular slide, but you can see that there are a number of applied linguistics areas that bear on cultural linguistics as he constructs it, and also, of course, I mean, it's two-way traffic, so the idea is that his approach on cultural linguistics is also going to influence those fields of intercultural communication, cross-cultural pragmatics, world Englishes, political discourse analysis on the applied side of things. And then at the bottom of the slide you can see some of the areas, the more theoretically oriented areas, where Sharifian has taken ideas for his own approach. They include things that are much more known to psychologists and cognitive scientists than to linguists, but that is one of the things that is so peculiar about Farzad Sharifian. He has a very, very open mind, and he has read an awful lot and taken in a lot of ideas from very, very many different fields, which he has brought to bear on his own approach. Right, so cultural linguistics, as he understands it, is about cultural conceptualizations. So let's read that same extract a little bit further. So multidisciplinary origins that explores the relationship between language and cultural conceptualizations. I'll explain in a moment, or I'll try to explain what he means by that. So cultural linguistics engages with features of human languages, it's linguistics after all, that encode or instantiate culturally constructed conceptualizations, so things that we conceive in our minds and translate into language. And the features that he engages with encompass the whole range of human experience. Now, he distinguishes three types of cultural conceptualizations, which he calls cultural schemas, cultural categories, and cultural metaphors. And as the little diagram at the bottom shows, there is that continuous interaction with linguistic areas such as morphosyntax, semantics, pragmatics, and a point that Sharifian also makes is that these schemas, categories, metaphors, because they are cultural, may significantly differ from one culture to another, but what they all share is the fact that they are encoded in or instantiated by the language spoken by the people who uphold these schemas, categories, and metaphors. Now, let me briefly say something about schemas, categories, and metaphors. So schemas are in fact very broad abstractions based on the collective knowledge associated with a particular cultural group, and they are therefore based on shared experience common to the group, or largely common to the group, as opposed to being abstracted from one single individual's idiosyncratic experience. One of the features here of his approach is that Sharifian clearly recognizes that not everybody has the same broad collective knowledge, but that there is some sort of an abstraction. The cultural schema is an abstraction, and say if the abstraction consists of elements, I simplify of course, consists of elements A, B, C, D, E, then some people will have them all five, A, B, C, D, E, in their own instance, in their own instantiation of the cultural schema. Some people will have A, B, C, D, other people will have A, B, D, E, some people may only have 2 or 3 of them, so it is distributed over the community, but if you make an abstraction, then it boils down to one particular schema of 5 elements. So these abstractions relate to beliefs, norms, rules, etc., that are grounded in a particular culture, and here is an example for you, which I quote from Sharifian again. So in some languages, for example Chinese, the speech act of greeting is closely associated with the Chinese cultural schemas of eating and food. So it is important for a Westerner who visits China to understand that when a Chinese person asks him, "Hi, have you eaten yet?" in Chinese, or maybe even in English, if this Chinese person is not sufficiently aware of American culture or English-speaking culture, that this is not strictly speaking an invitation to go out for dinner. As far as I understand, it is a greeting. A little bit like in the English-speaking world, in Australia in particular, we use a very Australian broad "how are ya" for "how are you," and well, that is not. It's not because we care about how people really are in Australia. We just greet them like that. We don't say hi. Well, we can say hi or hello, but we say typically "how are ya." And we say to everyone, even to the people that we absolutely have never met before and will never meet again. We don't give a damn about how they feel, we greet them that way. But you need to know these things. Cultural categories are situated at a lower level compared to cultural schemas, and examples of cultural categories include colors, emotions, attributes, foodstuffs, kinship terms, events, etc., that have reflections in the language. An example again, here Sharifian opposes wedding as a cultural category towards wedding as a schema. So as a cultural category, it refers to a type of event. An event that is different from the engagement that precedes it, or from dining out, or from divorce, obviously. But wedding as a cultural schema includes all the knowledge that is part of the Western ideal, perhaps, of wedding. So the procedures that need to be followed, the laws that need to be applied, the paperwork that needs to be filled out, the preparations for a religious service, for a civilian service, and all of that. And of course, all of that is reflected in the language. Finally, cultural metaphors. They involve a form of conceptualization across different domains because they are metaphors. So across a source domain and a target domain. In more technical terms, says Sharifian, we can say that cultural and conceptual metaphors are a form of cross-domain conceptualization. Actually, Sharifian's cultural metaphors are very close to what most of you may already have heard of in terms of conceptual metaphor, a la Lakoff. So it's very, very close, except that Lakoff started off by thinking that all cultural metaphors were English and universal, whereas, of course, in the meantime, some people, even in the cognitive linguistics movement, have come to the realization that cultural metaphors, or conceptual metaphors, because they are in fact cultural, can be vastly different from one culture to the next. So these cultural metaphors are rooted in cultural traditions, such as a particular worldview, a spiritual belief system, and here is, of course, one example that we all are familiar with. In many industrialized societies, people conceptualize time as a commodity that can be saved, to save time, spend time, budget time. Time is money. Time is the notion that is being conceptualized in terms that are more concrete, and that's why it is printed in small capitals in exactly the same way that he prints wedding as a category, or also as a schema in small capitals to tell his reader, look, I'm not talking about a word here, but I'm talking about a conceptualization. Now, where are cultural values in all that? Because for me personally, one of the cornerstones of my own work, of my own approach, is cultural values. Where are the cultural values in cultural linguistics? You would think that they occupy a pretty prominent place. I've gone through most of Sharifian's writings, and I have found reference to such things as beliefs and values, beliefs, values and norms, norms and values, values and principles, rules, values and traditions, beliefs, norms, customs, traditions and values, etc. No definition of the word cultural value whatsoever. He doesn't seem to use it as a technical term of any kind. He seems to consider values as some sort of cultural schema, but it's all very unclear to me. They're always lumped together with other categories, and so therefore surprisingly, within cultural linguistics, a la Sharifian, cultural values are not given the central place which I think they deserve in any modern theory within the general field of cultural linguistics, because in day-to-day conversation people talk a lot, especially in the English-speaking world, about cultural values, and the term is spreading to other languages as well. So the French, the Germans, the Dutch, the Russians no doubt as well talk a lot about cultural values these days. It started in English, but why is there no prominent place for cultural values in the framework par excellence that represents the broad area of cultural linguistics? I simply have no answer to that question. I have discussed this with Farzad Sharifian. He sort of can see where I'm coming from, but he's not going to change his approach to the whole instance. Now, cultural values are of course reflected in language in the same way that, according to Sharifian, cultural schemas and cultural metaphors and cultural categories are, and no one to my mind has said this more clearly than the Polish linguist Anna Vezhbitskaya, who in 1991 first, in 2003 it was republished, defined the 4 basic premises in intercultural communication. She said, and these look like very straightforward and obvious statements, but maybe now they are more obvious than they would have been 20 years ago or 30 years ago. In different societies and different communities, people speak differently. These differences in ways of speaking are profound and systematic. Different ways of speaking reflect different cultural values, or at least different hierarchies of values. And then the 4th point is just saying that once you have found that a different way of speaking reflects a different cultural value, you need independent evidence to back that up, so that it's not just a sort of a hypothesis made based on just one particular difference in speaking specific to one particular language community. So, what do we mean by values first before talking about cultural values? In the French sociological tradition, they are models, ideals stored deep in the human psyche that guide individuals to act in certain ways. They inspire us in our actions, in our ways of thinking. They can only be reached through inference based on external observables. We can't see values, obviously. Someone can't just put all his values on a silver tray and give it to me and say, here are my cultural values. It doesn't work that way. So we've got to infer them from their behavior. People may waver in their values, and values may change over time, but they will always be there to inspire our actions and to define who we are. So values, in other words, are general beliefs that determine how we assess real or imagined behaviors, specifically other people's behaviors, not our own, deeming some of them appropriate, desirable, valued, and others inappropriate, undesirable, or poorly valued. Now here's a nice quote from Norman Fedder, who is an Australian psychologist, and he says, or he said some time ago, the values that people hold are fewer in number than the much larger set of specific attitudes and beliefs that they express and endorse. So that's the same distinction again between what we can readily see and what we have to infer. Values are not equal in importance, he says, but they form a hierarchy of importance for each individual. So different people may have different hierarchies of values, with some values being more important than others. Values have some stability about them, but they may change in relative importance depending on changing circumstances. They are not, and I quite like this phrase, they are not cold cognitions, but they are linked to the affective system. People feel happy when their important values are fulfilled, and they are angry when their values are frustrated. So cultural values then, I think we can define them as values that appear to be widespread, largely upheld, that is within a lingua culture. I'm not saying that all Russians for instance, share the same set of cultural values, but there is a large set of values out there that seems to be generally shared among Russians. Some people, well, of course, what I'm saying here about Russians applies to any language culture. They are widespread, but not necessarily universally upheld within a particular community. They underpin the beliefs, convictions, attitudes, and communicative habits generally associated with that language culture. They are not all equally important, hence the idea of a hierarchy, and they are not universally shared by all members of a language culture. So cultural values, as I have already anticipated, are the backbone of my own approach, applied ethnolinguistics, which started off in 2009 under the name ethnolinguistic pathways model. One article which is available, I think, online somewhere. If you Google ethnolinguistic pathways model, it will probably come up. But as of 2013, I called my own approach applied ethnolinguistics, and I distinguish 6 different pathways within applied ethnolinguistics, depending on which is going to be the starting point that I take for the exploration of cultural values or the discovery of cultural values in language. So ethnolexicology, ethnophraseology, ethnosyntax, ethnorhetorics, ethnopragmatics, and ethnoaxiology. Now I'm going to briefly take you through 2 of the 6 definitions. All the definitions are fairly identical, because the idea is always the same. What we do is we take a particularly salient point of the language, be it a word or a phrase or a syntactic structure or whatever, and we start pulling that apart, taking it apart, see what people have said about it, see how it functions in discourse, and we try on the basis of all the information we gather in that way to see if there is some sort of a common pattern that surfaces and a cultural value that might be sitting underneath. That cultural value will be hypothetical, of course, because as I said before, you can't base a cultural value on just one fact of language. You will have to corroborate it later on. So let's look at the definition of ethnolexicology. It is the study of culturally salient lexical items. It relies on linguistic as well as non-linguistic evidence with a view to discovering whether any cultural values previously known or newly discovered underpin these items. Values that were previously known will thus be better understood. The reality of newly discovered values will subsequently have to be proven via other means. Most of my work I have done on French. An example of an ethnolexicological study that I have undertaken is on the French keyword langue de bois, which translates in English as wooden language and refers to something like administrative pompous talk that says a lot without saying anything. And as you may imagine, the French don't like it for one bit. But it is everywhere. So ethnophraseology, I'm not going to take you through the entire definition, but it is a very similar definition. There I've studied phrases such as on va s'arranger, so we'll work something out, something like that. The French say it all the time. And also a very commonly used French phrase is c'est pas ma faute, it's not my mistake, it's not my fault, I'm not responsible, don't blame me. English are always struck by the fact that English speakers, are always struck by the fact that whereas they are always the first to apologize and to say, oh, I'm sorry, that is the whole opposite of what the French do. The French will wait as long as possible to apologize for a mistake that they made as is possible, only if there is no other way out. Maybe this is a bit of a caricature, of course, but I think there is a lot of truth in it. So ethnosyntax, I'm not going to take you through the details here. So ethnorhetorics, there is a whole area of imagery in the French language that is built around the so-called café du commerce. So it's what used to be in days gone by the sort of café at the central square of any village or town where people would get together and discuss. Usually the discussions would be of a fairly low level, but at least it is an indication of, I believe, a French cultural value, namely the French cultural value of standing up for what you believe in and having a point of view and uttering it, defending it. rather than say, oh well, I don't really have a viewpoint on that, which is again a much more American approach. People tend not to take, of course there are always exceptions, but in general people tend to be less speedy in taking a stand in the English-speaking world than they are in the French-speaking world, where people have an opinion about everything. That is what I have literally found in the literature. People have an opinion about everything, even about the things that they haven't got the slightest clue about. Right. Okay, so ethnopragmatics, I have studied a particular French phenomenon which is called la râlerie, so whinging if you like, but in the French way, etc. And then in ethnoaxiology is actually then the approach that takes off where the others end. So once I have defined my hypothetical cultural value based on a particular effect of language, I then look for extra evidence in other areas of the language, or also for non-linguistic evidence to try and corroborate the hypothesis that I came up with. If I can't find any corroborating evidence, it probably means the hypothesis is not right. And so there I have, in ethnoaxiological studies I have studied cultural values such as la méfiance, called distrust or mistrust in English, but that's a very wrong translation, because distrust and mistrust are words that are charged with negativity in English. They are negative things. You shouldn't be distrustful, you shouldn't mistrust people. But in French, la méfiance is something that is considered as a national virtue, as a quality. You have to be distrustful, if I could say it that way, but it just doesn't sound right in English. But in French, if you say, for instance, il faut se méfier, that is a perfectly valid statement that everybody will immediately agree with. Etc., etc. So cultural values, as I said, are the backbones of applied ethnolinguistics, and all 6 pathways in my own work have been applied with the foreign language classroom in mind. So the whole idea is that, and I have tried this out in my university teaching in Australia, is that I take university students who have a certain advanced level of the language through facts of language, and I build with them towards a hypothetical cultural value based on a particular fact of language, and from there on in then go on to corroborate the hypothesis with more evidence. But it doesn't have to be that way. A couple of years ago I published I edited a special issue of the International Journal of Language and Culture, the main editor of which is, guess who, Farzad Sharifian. And in that journal issue there are a number of papers where the foreign language classroom is not generally prominent, but at least the idea that is followed is more or less the same. The studies that come under applied ethnolinguistics, as long as they contribute to a better understanding of the language-culture nexus and underscore the rich and complex relationship between language and cultural values, I think we can include them.
We have 20 minutes left.
20 minutes left, that should be fine. So applied ethnolinguistics versus cultural linguistics then. So my framework in small capitals against Farzad Sharifian's framework in small capitals. So on the face of it, there seems to be little prospect for an amalgamation of the two, because I mean this is how this whole paper of mine started. One day a couple of years ago, Farzad Sharifian found out about my own work, and he invited me over to Monash to give a talk and to explain my own view on cultural linguistics. And eventually that was published, and what I'm telling you today is based on those publications, and the papers were also actually called applied ethnolinguistics is cultural linguistics, but is it cultural linguistics? And the point that I made there too when he invited me was, I said, look, I don't think we will ever get married. Let's put it that way. We will ever sort of adopt the same principles. We are both doing cultural linguistics, but cultural linguistics as a broad area, small c, small l. You do what you call cultural linguistics with initial capital C and capital L, or if you like with small capitals, and I do applied ethnolinguistics, and they are different. Why are they different? Because, as I have said, cultural linguistics, as far as I'm concerned, underrates the importance of cultural values, lumping them together with one of the 3 types of cultural conceptualizations. And for applied ethnolinguistics, my own approach, cultural value is just the backbone. And I'm not going to give up the thought hasn't crossed my mind for one split second that I'm going to give up cultural values and start talking about cultural schemas, metaphors and categories. So is there any chance that cultural linguistics will give the term cultural value wider currency? So is there, I can't see much, I can't see myself getting very close to what Farzad Sharifian is doing, but might he perhaps, without necessarily giving up his schemas, his categories and his metaphors of course, might he make a little bit more room for cultural values? Well, there have been at least two missed opportunities, as far as I can tell from the literature, in a book called Applied Cultural Linguistics, which Sharifian co-edited together with his mentor Gary Palmer in 2007. There was a paper by a certain Ian Malcolm, and he said, he referred to a method of inquiry that is able to keep in focus both linguistic difference and competing cultural values. He was talking about cultural linguistics as conceived by Sharifian. And it is here, he says, that cultural linguistics has a unique contribution to make. But it remained, as we say in French, lettre morte. I can't think of the English phrase right now, so it doesn't. It has landed on deaf ears. It doesn't seem to have gone anywhere. That invitation by Palmer, by Malcolm, to actually open cultural linguistics up to cultural values, because everybody in the real world out there talks about cultural values, and we have a rough idea of what they are. If you talk to people about cultural conceptualizations, cultural metaphors, cultural schemas and cultural categories, they probably don't know what you're talking about. So it's not a very user-friendly theory in that sense, Sharifian's approach. I mean, it's okay for those people who know the framework and who work within it, but if you want to make your theory applicable for a larger audience, which I try to do by applying it in the foreign language classroom, then you need to work with words that everybody can understand, or that many people can understand. Another missed opportunity, in fact in the same volume, there was a paper by Anna Vezhbitskaya and her close associate Cliff Goddard. They were not part of the workshop that actually or the proceedings of which were published as the volume Applied Cultural Linguistics, but they were invited later on to contribute a chapter as well, since they are prominently working in an area of cultural linguistics, small c, small l. The strange thing is that they hardly talk, in spite of the fact that their chapter was included in this volume Applied Cultural Linguistics. They hardly use the word or the term cultural linguistics. They use the term cultural value more than all the other authors taken together. But it doesn't seem to, once again to have made any difference. They were just included in that chapter, maybe to make the book look a little bit more respectable. Maybe Sharifian didn't have enough chapters for a decent publication, so he invited, among others, Vezhbitskaya and Goddard to contribute. They did not contribute on cultural linguistics as far as Sharifian construes the term, but they were talking obviously about cultural linguistics with a small c and a small l. And indeed, I've been wondering whether the book that Sharifian and Palmer co-edited back in 2007 is about applied cultural linguistics as a particular framework, or is it about a broad area of applied cultural linguistics. And I have the impression that it's more about a broad area than about one particular stream or one particular area of research within the broader field. Okay, so another reason why there is little prospect for an amalgamation of applied ethnolinguistics and cultural linguistics is that applied ethnolinguistics relies on something called NSM, the natural semantic metalanguage, associated with the work of Anna Vezhbitskaya and also Cliff Goddard and several others. Applied ethnolinguistics relies on this particular tool to explicate the cultural values that it seeks to define. Now, very briefly, what is natural semantic metalanguage? I'll talk about what has just popped up in a moment. What is natural semantic metalanguage? It is a mini language. It consists of a mini lexicon, 65 words or word-like elements only, in its purest form, and each of these elements has its own grammar, and so the words or the word-like elements can be combined together in little sentences, and this is the only material that we use in order to explicate cultural values. So it's a very limited, very highly constrained meta-language, but it is a meta-language that has the virtue of being universal. So what we are claiming is that on the basis of all the empirical research that we've done, and that is research that now spans several decades, we can say that we can find lexicalizations of all 65 of these conceptual blocks in the lexicon of the meta-language in all the languages that we have looked at, no matter how typologically and genetically different they are. So we've looked at literally languages from the four corners of the planet, and we have found that these elements are there in all of them. And we have also tried to define ways in which these elements can combine in order to make them function as a language. And again, we have made sure not to include any grammatical rules that pose problems in any of the languages that we have looked at. So it is a really universal tool. The primes are semantically simple. It means you can't analyze them further, you can't define them further. If you try to do so, you make them more complex again. You have to use more difficult words. So or elements, these words are literally the simplest possible words, and the advantage of such an approach, of course, is that it can be readily, anything written in one version of the meta-language, say English, can readily be translated into the Russian version of the meta-language, or the Japanese version, or the Swahili version, or the Yankunchara version, to quote an Aboriginal language from Australia. It can be done, and these people, the people who know their own meta-language, will have an exact idea about what a particular cultural value or what a particular word or a phrase in another language means. Whereas if you've got to rely on highly technical terms, most of the time foreigners won't understand what you're talking about. Only highly specialized individuals such as linguists will know, and of course it's not going to be very practical in terms of usefulness of the research. So, just going back very quickly if I can. So, just going back very quickly if I can to so just to acknowledge that the closest any author working within cultural linguistics as a narrowly defined area is actually Palmer, who recognized not so long ago that there may be cogent reasons for the use of NSM, such as the advantage of making definitions understandable to native speakers as well as researchers, but he has also repeatedly said in other publications, well, we in cultural linguistics, we don't quite see the need for that. We don't need to go that far. I beg to disagree. I think we do need to go that far. So here is a table, the English table of the natural semantic meta-language, just the lexicon. I'm not going to talk about the grammar, it would take too much time, but here are the 65 elements that make up the meta-language. They are, as much as possible, we do allow, under very strict conditions, some other terms to be used somehow too, because just try and imagine, try and work on an explication of the English word spoon with just these 65 words. I don't think it can be done. So obviously you need to make certain provisions which we call semantic molecules. They are slightly more complex ideas, but they are explicated in terms of the primes, and we scaffold the whole thing until we can actually it's not an arbitrary example that I give you there. Vezhbitskaya a few years ago wrote a 30-page long, I think, paper proposing an explication in NSM of the English word spoon. Right, okay, so NSM at work. Here is one example, and I've taken a Russian example. Now, I hope that I pronounced this correctly. It's something like Ishkrenast. Iskrenast, okay, so often translated in English as sincerity, frankness, spontaneity. Well, try and convince Russians. Try and explain, well, if you explain to English people that is the meaning of the word iskrenast, then well, yes, that is sort of approximate. But for Russians, of course, words such as sincerity, frankness, spontaneity don't mean much, because they are English words, they are highly technical words, they are culturally charged words, and they don't make a lot of sense unless you've got a fairly advanced knowledge of English. But here is a go at it in natural semantic meta-language. Now, many people think like this. I'm not saying that this is correct. This is Vezhbitskaya's attempt at explicating the Russian cultural value of iskrenast. So many people think like this. At many times someone says something good to someone else because this someone wants this other someone to know what this someone is thinking at that time, not because of anything else. It is good if it is like this. And similarly, at many times someone says something good to someone else because this someone wants this other someone to know what this someone feels at that time, not because of anything else, and it is good if it is like this. Very simple words. I can't enter into a discussion about whether this is a correct explication of the Russian word or if it isn't, but I think it goes, or I'd like to think that it goes further than a simple paraphrase in terms of spontaneity or frankness or sincerity, because they are just other words of the same or a higher semantic complexity level than the Russian word. They are probably not as common as the Russian word, so they only go a certain way towards explicating what the Russian word stands for. Okay, I'm going to conclude now. So, applied ethnolinguistics, my framework, and cultural linguistics, the broad area of research, even though, as I said before, it is unlikely that applied ethnolinguistics will eventually amalgamate with cultural linguistics as a narrow area of research, I do hope that they can learn from one another and engage in a mutually enriching dialogue. I believe that both provide useful methodologies for the study of language and culture, and that both are forms of a kind of linguistics that recognizes, as more and more linguists nowadays do, that language is so much more than a matter of pure cognition, and it is above all perhaps a matter of culture. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.